Hey there, everybody. I'm Pete Pardo from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of one of our kind of top picks of a specific genre shows. We did one recently where I gave you some of my top hard rock and metal albums of the 1970s. So, as promised, we're going to do a prog show. So, I've got here a stack, small stack, that's arguable, I guess, of some of my top progressive rock albums of the 70s. Now, these are going to be a mix of some fairly well-known bands, obviously. Some maybe not as well-known. Fear not if you don't hear some really obscure stuff here today. I'm actually going to do a part two of this where I'm going to pick some really obscure bands of the 70s that I like quite a bit. But I wanted to go today more for mostly well-known progressive rock albums. And again, in keeping with line with the hard rock and metal show, I am not going to repeat any bands, so you're going to see one release, my favorite from each band that they released in the 70s. I'm not going to do these in the order that they were released, and I'm not going to mention release dates. I don't think it's that important here, but basically 1970 to 1979, these are my top albums from these prog bands that they released in that decade. Some of these may not be the most well-known album that this band released. Okay, this is my personal preference. Which ones are my favorites? There's obviously some that are real classics that if you don't already have, you should have. But if some of these you don't have, I'm highly recommending them because they're probably my favorites from these bands from this area. So we're going to start off with a band who arguably jump-started the entire prog genre. Okay, I know that is a contentious topic. Who actually started prog? Some say the Beatles, some say the Moody Blues. For my money, progressive rock, as we would later come to know it as, was created by King Crimson. My favorite album, of course, I would have normally picked In the Core of the Crimson King, but that's technically not in the 70s. So I'm going to go with my second favorite, which is actually my favorite album from the band and from that time period. It is Larks, Tongues, in Aspic. Classic album, you know, when you got Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 1 and 2, doesn't get much better than that. Book of Saturday, Exiles, Easy Money, and the Talking Drum. Bruford, Fripp, Wetton, Cross. I mean, come on. It's just, you know, Jamie Muir on this album as well. It doesn't get much better than that, folks. This is savage, avant-garde, progressive bits of free jazz. I mean, it's just, you know, basically King Crimson, when they first came out, were like unlike anything we'd ever heard before. This is a classic album if you do not have it. So here's a band that also appeared on my top hard rock and metal albums of the 70s because they kind of fit both in the heavier music as well as prog. I'm sure you know I'm talking about Rush here, right? So, of course, Hemispheres appeared on the other show. And for this one, I had to do Farewell to Kings. You know, I almost couldn't decide between the two of them for the hard rock and metal show. And both albums are damn proggy, as is this one. This is probably my favorite Rush album of all time. Okay, I think this one is maybe a little less heavy than Hemispheres. Certainly is proggy. So, you know, some classic tunes. You got the title track, Xanadu, Cinderella Man, Madrigal, Cygnus X1. You know, that's legendary right here. Okay, going to go over to Britain. A band that kind of toiled in the periphery of progressive rock and more mainstream pop. This band I quite a bit, and this is probably their most progressive album, arguably, but probably it's Supertramp, Crime of the Century. You know, these guys kind of, I probably should have picked ELO for this show as well. I did not, although I think they kind of fall into a similar category of kind of progressive rock, a lot of pop, that sort of thing, but Bloody Well Right, title track, Rudy, Dreamer, Asylum. A lot of great tunes on here. It's prog in my eyes. Really, really good album. Okay, Supergroup. Okay, late 70s. John Wetton, Bill Bruford, Alan Holdsworth, Eddie Jobson. You know it. UK. A classic album of prog and jazz fusion. Unfortunately, this would be the only album with this lineup, you know, because Bruford wound up leaving, Holdsworth wound up leaving. But for this album, In the Dead of Night, 30 Years, Alaska, Mental Medication, a lot of great tunes on here. Stunning Holdsworth guitar work. Great rhythms from, and vocals from Wetton, but rhythms from Bruford and Wetton, Jobson's keyboards and violin. Just a landmark album from, a great supergroup from the 70s. Okay, here's something I had to include an album from this guy and this band because it's damn progressive. He had so many in the 70s to choose from, but this has always been my favorite. This album is basically perfection from start to finish. I am talking about Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, One Size Fits All. Inca Roads, just so many great tunes on here. Incredible keyboard work from George Duke. Of course, you got Zappa's legendary guitar work. The rhythms are fantastic. Again, it kind of bridged the gap between prog and jazz fusion, a little psychedelia, orchestral work. Zappa just was a genius at creating like musical arrangements that just transcended genres. So if you don't have One Size Fits All, you need it in your collection. All right, here's probably the most obvious one I'm going to pick today, okay, because it's probably one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever released by a band that, when you think of prog, you always think of this band. Definitely the top one or two or three progressive rock bands in history. Of course, I'm talking about Yes, Close to the Edge. 3 tracks. You got the Close to the Edge title track, epic. You've got And You and I, another melodic epic, and then, of course, my personal favorite, Siberian True. It's all you need, right? 3 long tunes. Steve Howe, John Anderson, Chris Squire, Alan White, Rick Wakeman. Sorry, not Alan White. Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford's last album. Just an incredible album that just never gets old. Never gets old. All right. Here's another band. Had a couple choices. Wasn't sure which one to pick. This might be my favorite of them. This is Camel, Moon Madness. Camel were one of those bands, they never really reached the heights of, like, say, Yes and Genesis and King Crimson and Pink Floyd and so on and so forth. But they were kind of like that next wave underneath. Really melodic music, thanks to the guitar playing of Andrew Latimer and some great keyboards, really cool vocals. Not a highly aggressive band, but just really melodic, symphonic sounds. And this, it's got Lunar Sea on this album, which is one of my favorite Camel tunes, but a lot of really great songs on here. Just a really good symphonic prog album from the early 70s that a band that gets really underrated in my book. All right, so this band kind of started off as more of a blues rock band, then started to take on more hard rock elements and bits of jazz, and then all of a sudden they veered off into progressive rock. Put out a couple albums that, 2 of them particularly, which I was going to choose here, but I thought it would be too obvious, and I decided to pick an album that has really become one of my favorites from these guys over the years, because it's like half of it's really kind of rocking, real kind of heavy. The other half is kind of like really progressive, kind of folky, which they dabbled in quite a bit. I'm talking about Jethro Tull, Minstrel in the Gallery. When people talk about Jethro Tull and prog, they always talk about Thick as a Brick and Aqualung and A Passion Play, rightfully so. My favorite album by them is Benefit, but that's really not proggy at all. One of my other favorites, Thick as a Brick obviously is a favorite, but it just seemed like a very obvious pick here. I wanted to kind of go a little against the grain, and I really love this album a lot. And like I said, I've really liked this more as the years have gone on. There's some really proggy stuff on here. I mean, Baker Street Muse, the title track, Cold Winds of Valhalla, but in a way that mixed like prog and heavy rock. And then of course you got the more folky things like Requiem and Black Satin Dancer, One White Duck, just great material. Ian Anderson at the top of his game. Martin Barr, guitars off the charts. Just a really stunning album that gets better with age. All right, another band that was almost a chore to pick. My favorite from this era because, quite frankly, every one of their albums up until like the latter part of the decade are drop-dead classics and could have, be included here. I've often dabbled back and forth between Three Friends and In a Glass House and Octopus. But, ultimately, this album probably top to bottom is my favorite. It's perfection. Advent of Panurge, Raconteur, Troubadour, Cry for Everyone, Knots. How can you not include Octopus for Knots? Boys in the Band, Dog's Life. It's just great. It's this complex. It's really like nothing. I said it before with King Crimson, how when they first came out, there was like nothing you'd ever heard before. These guys kind of took that to another level. Just really, really different. There was no band like Gentle Giant. Still to this day, and I love them to death. And this is a classic. And of course, you got the Roger Dean artwork. Gotta love that. All right, so perhaps my favorite prog band of all time. Okay, specifically from the years 1970 through 79 or so. Talking about Genesis, for me, the Peter Gabriel era is pretty much untouchable. Again, a couple of really, really strong albums that all deserve to be here. Nursery Crime was kind of the one that I was going to go with, but in the end, it always goes back to Foxtrot. I got a terrific glare there. Because, when you got Watcher of the Skies and Get 'Em Out by Friday, Can Utility and the Coastliners, and of course Supper's Ready, it's really hard to pick against this one. Really is. Gabriel, Collins, Rutherford, Banks, and Hackett. It doesn't get much better than that, folks. A wonderful, lovely, wonderful, challenging album that just always near and dear. All right, here's, I was going to save this for one of the more obscure ones, but I figured because the guitar player came from a very, very popular band, I figure I'm going to include this here. And this actually was a fairly big seller at the time, and a really good album. It's the debut from Peter Banks and Flash. I like this a lot. It sounds a lot like the early Yes, obviously, because you got Peter Banks there. Some really interesting and complex guitar and keyboard work. The songs are very Yes-like and epic sounding, very melodic. I dig this a lot. Out of the three Flash albums, this is easily the best. But if you've never ventured into the world of Flash, I highly recommend getting at it. It's quite good. All right. The Dutch band Focus, of course, had to be included here. Moving Waves is my favorite album. It's obviously their most popular album, but there's a reason why. When you got Hocus Pocus and Janus and Moving Waves, Focus 2, and of course the multi-length epic suite Eruption. You got the flutes and the Hammond from Thys van Leer, if that's how he says his name. You got Jan Akkerman's guitar work. Again, prog and jazz fusion kind of collide in here, a little bit of folky stuff. Really, really good. There's a lot of very solid Focus albums from the early 70s, but that has always kind of been their classic in my eyes. All right, another band, probably a top 3, 4, or 5 prog band from the 70s in the eyes of most. Definitely one of the big 4, right? Talking about ELP. Which album do you choose from ELP, right? So many good ones. I like all of them. Love all of them. I always seem to go back to this one just a little bit over Brain Salad Surgery and Trilogy for my money. And their first one, their debut, is fantastic too. I don't know, something about Tarkus just defines what prog is all about. It's just so damn epic. The Epic Link title track is just an amazing example of bombastic keyboard work from Keith Emerson. What else you got here? Jeremy Bender, Bitches Crystal, The Only Way, Infinite Space, Time and a Place, Are You Ready, Eddie? It's epic, it's classic, virtuoso. Yeah, these guys were probably the first prog supergroup, and they lived up to it big time. All right, from there, we're going to go over to Germany. For a band that I like quite a bit. They put out a lot of really good albums in the 70s. It kind of started off as kind of like a hard rock band, like that Deep Purple kind of Hammond organ guitar type of thing. And then they went into like this glorious Pink Floyd style prog. And my favorite album by them is Silent Cries and Mighty Echoes. again, just if you love kind of soaring melodic guitar solos and really cool, creepy synths, very Floydish, maybe a little heavier than Pink Floyd. I really, really like this album a lot. Probably my number 2 from them is Oceans, which came out shortly after, but I always kind of go back to Silent Cries and Mighty Echoes. It's a really, really strong one. All right, here's a band that's may not exactly fit into this this list here, but I always saw them more as kind of like a prog band. They're also kind of a fusion band. If we ever decide to do a fusion show, I'm going to bring them back for that as well, but they kind of fit here too. I'm talking about What If by the Dixie Dregs, Steve Morse and Company, all instrumental, complicated music. It's got bits of prog and jazz fusion, a little bits of country and southern rock, all blues, all kind of rolled up into one little bluegrass. It's virtuoso, violins and guitars and keyboards and drums and bass. Just an incredible, incredible album. Get it for the Odyssey song, if nothing else. All right. Oh, back over to Britain. Another band that probably were not at that upper echelon, but that kind of like that second tier of like influential prog bands from the 70s. I'm talking about Peter Hamel and Company, Van der Graaf Generator, Pawn Hearts, my favorite album by them, Lemmings, Man Erg. Great stuff. You know, you got the epic Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. Dark, ominous music. Very unique band. Nobody sang like Peter Hamel, ever. The creepy organ, the saxophone, right? Occasional bits of guitar. Just really kind of dark and doomy music for prog for the time period in the early 70s. A really, really great band. Again, that never were reached the heights of like, you know, Yes and Genesis and so on and so forth. But definitely right up there. Okay, here's a band that I unfortunately didn't really, you know, I always kind of liked them, but I never really got into them heavily until like the last like 5 years or so. And I think a number of their early albums definitely are deserving of the prog tag, especially this one. And this is a legendary album. This is a band that probably spearheaded the whole twin guitar thing, mixing, you know, prog and hard rock and folk. I'm talking about Wishbone Ash, Argus. Time was, sometime world, blowing free, the king will come, leaf and stream, warrior, and throw down the sword. Each one a classic. Guitar mastery, twin lead melodic guitars, complex arrangements, wonderful melodies, little folky atmosphere. An amazing, amazing album, a legendary album from a legendary band. All right, this may be a surprise for a few that I would put this on there, but this is, I love this album. It is just prog excess at its best. This is the debut album from Todd Rundgren's Utopia. I've loved this album for decades, and, you know, Utopia theme, Freak Parade, Freedom Fighters, and The Icon, all epic, blazing dual synths. Rundgren's guitar work, just killer rhythms. This is, you know, Rundgren already had a solo career going. He's mainly known for being a pop star, but he wanted to do a full-on progressive rock album, and this is it, folks. A killer, killer, killer album if you have not heard it or don't own it. All right, going to go ahead a few years. Later in the 70s, a band, again, that for some might be a stretch to include here, but I think enough of their 70s albums touched on prog as well as hard rock, and I think this album probably put them both together perfectly. They had some radio hits out of this as well as some really great deep album tracks that are basically prog for me. I'm talking about Styx, The Grand Illusion. Love this album to death. You know, you got the title track, Fooling Yourself, Superstars, of course, Come Sail Away, Miss America, blistering hard rock tune, but then more importantly, you got Man in the Wilderness, Castle Walls, and the grand finale at the end. With this great kind of prog crescendo to finish out the album. Love this album to death. A classic. Call them classic rock, hard rock, but there's a lot of prog on here. You know, arguably you could also pick Pieces of Eight, Crystal Ball, or Equinox. Any of their early albums, really. All really, really great and have plenty of prog. All right, eventually I get to these guys, right? You know, a lot of people always kind of go back to Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. For my money, when you're talking about Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here, or most notably Animals, are my two favorite albums by this band. This is progressive rock, folks, with a little touch of that kind of weird psychedelia that Floyd had always brought to the table. What do you got here? Pigs on the Wing, Part 1 and 2. You got Dogs, Sheep. Again, all these titles based on animals, but just searing Gilmour guitar. Rick Wright's wonderful keyboards. You got Roger Waters and Gilmour's vocals. Just a great, creepy album, too. It's one of the things I've always liked about it. For those of you who participate in all sorts of recreational things, this is a wonderful album for that, I'm sure. And a classic, one of my favorite albums from the 70s. All right, we're winding down here, folks. Another band, kind of a British band who spent a lot of time in Germany. Released a bunch of great albums in the 70s. Again, that kind of bridged that gap between kind of hard rock, keyboard and guitar-led hard rock and full-on prog. Talking about Nektar, Remember the Future, probably their best-selling album. Easily their most progressive. Probably my top two favorites for me. I was going to pick Tab in the Ocean, but this is obviously more of a prog album. It's got the two side-long epics. Kind of throw this in the same bucket as like Thick as a Brick sort of thing, right? Great melodies, great guitar work, great vocals, great keyboards. A really, really great band who released a lot of very, very strong albums in the 70s, and this is right at the top of it. All right, here's one. Again, arguably, whether it belongs here or not, but I always saw Max Webster from Canada as kind of a heavier prog band with a lot of kind of cool pop things going on. Think of more of a prog version and more of a heavier version of the Tubes. Another band probably could have belonged here. This is High Class and Borrowed Shoes. Dig this album a lot. You got the title track, Diamonds, Diamonds, In Context of the Moon, America's Veins, Words to Words, Oh War, On the Road. Great stuff. Killer guitar work and keyboard work, and the rhythms are great. It's complex, it's proggy, it's heavy, it's mainstreamy, it's a little bit everything. Underrated band. All right, The Roaring Silence by Manfred Mann's Earth Band. Again, another band that had a lot of really good albums in the 70s that kind of bridged the gap between like pop and prog and hard rock. I dig this one a lot. I mean, obviously it's got Blinded by the Light, one of the best cover songs ever. Took Bruce Springsteen's folky track, kind of unknown track, and made it a mainstream, hit, which kind of combined prog and rock and just great stuff. Singing the Dolphin through, just a lot of really great tunes. Great keyboards, fantastic vocals. Manfred Mann is a very, very underrated keyboard player, and just a really, really good band. The lineup they had here was just really, really solid. All right. Before we venture into Italy for my last couple, I've got one more from the 70s from a band that's one of my favorites from America, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about here because I haven't mentioned them as of yet. I'm talking about Kansas. Which Kansas album do you pick here? I had in one hand Song for America, which, a top 3 Kansas album. And the other one I had in my hand was a much more mainstream hit for them because I had, obviously, the big hit in, Carry On Wayward Son. But more importantly, I just think that this album is just absolute perfection. Regardless of whether it was one of their biggest sellers, Point of No Return was obviously their bigger seller, but this was second right up to that. And I just think as a prog album, this succeeds from start to finish. You got The Wall, What's on My Mind, Miracles Out of Nowhere, Opus Insert, Questions of My Childhood, Cheyenne Anthem, and of course Magnum Opus. That's legendary right there. So, but in all fairness, Song for America deserves to be up there. Point of No Return deserves to be up there. Mass deserves to be up there. The first album deserves to be up there. It's just that's how strong that early Kansas catalog is. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So the last 4 I'm going to do, again, I was going to save this for the more underground, unknown bands on the prog side, but I think all of these bands here got a lot of notoriety from Italy at the time in the early 70s, and I you got to include them here, even though most of them probably didn't venture here to the U.S. much, or maybe didn't sell a lot of albums here in the U.S., but globally made quite an impact on the prog scene. The first one is Premiata, Forneria, Marconi, otherwise known as PFM. Per Nemico. You know, guys, Mellotrons and Moogs and all sorts of guitars, and it's lush, it's symphonic, it's rocking, it's just wonderful, all Italian vocals. The next we've got Le Orme, Felona e Sirona. Again, gorgeous Italian vocals, symphonic, bombastic keyboards, just epic stuff, romantic. A lot of the Italian prog is very romantic sounding. Just had that kind of emotional feel. Another one, Il Billetto di Bronzo, Is, or Vis, Is, I never know how they say it, Y-S. Fantastic, really bombastic. Hammond organ and Moogs and Mellotrons and heavy guitars and all sorts of just crazy stuff. This one is probably the most bombastic of all these here, but legendary stuff. And then last but not least, we've got Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, otherwise known as Banco, and the album in question is Il Sono Nato Libero. Okay, they got a lot of good albums. This is one of my favorites. Again, all sung in Italian. If you don't mind that, and I trust you, just don't not check these out because it's sung in Italian. It's kind of got that like operatic Italian vocal style. But the music is just so heartwarming. It's so 70s prog. If you love vintage sounding keyboards, like I said, you know, Hammond, Mellotron, Moogs, Celeste, electric piano, all that kind of stuff. Get that in spades with the Italians, right? Just great stuff. So anyway, that's ending my top 70s prog albums. I am Pete Pardo from Sea of Tranquility. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, of course, we're here on the mighty YouTube. So what do we got coming up? We've got a part 2 of this one with the more obscure stuff in a couple weeks, as well as a part 2 of our best hard rock and metal of the 70s, the underground, okay? So all those bands that kind of maybe didn't sell gold and platinum albums, but, you know, maybe they signed to a major label, put out an album and disappeared, or maybe they were never signed to a major label, but the notoriety of these bands has lasted since the 70s, and you can still find their music, and it's still worthwhile and worth talking about. That's the bands that I'm going to get into next. So till then, take care. We'll see you next time. Make sure you go and visit us on the web and check out all our music reviews. We've got another new product show coming up really soon. In addition, we're covering a lot of those, kind of doing those band retrospectives that you've asked for. So, you know, we got Sabbath and Purple coming up, and Triumph, Michael Schenker Group, Scorpions, Dio, Yes, all sorts of stuff you guys have asked for. I'm going to get to them all eventually. Have patience. We'll get there. But till next time, we'll see you soon. All right? Be good. Bye-bye.